Hello, everyone. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Cities and Transportation at MIT. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum, designed by the MIT Mobility Initiative. Today, we designated the discussion to the fiscal cliff of public transit. I'm really glad to have three brilliant minds have been thinking about this question for a long time to join us and share with us their thought on this question. So today we have Jim Aloisi, Fred Aloisi, and Jeremy Fine. Both Jim and Fred are from MIT. Both also were the Secretary of Transportation from Massachusetts. And Jeremy Fine is the Chief Financial Officer. Will bring a concrete example from Chicago Transit Authority. So in the past few years, we noticed that several things happened. One is COVID, lead to a radical ridership and revenue decline. Ridership has been recovering, but far below the pre-pandemic situation. Federal government stepped in, offered the emergency fund, but that funding is quickly running out. At the same time, the transit agency are actually being asked to do many other things. One is to decarbonize all the system, electric buses, hydrogen, etc. Second, to provide a good access for all. And also there are several calling for example, free services, etc. So how do we really provide all the service, upgrade the system at the same time with this so-called fiscal cliff? So join us today, Jim, Fred, and Jeremy will have guide us in thinking through this process, and hopefully generate some innovative ideas. Before I start, I also want to warm up a little bit in the chat. As before, I encourage everybody to type in your organization, your location, and the time, so we know the audience. So I will say MIT, Cambridge, MA, 12 noon. While we're doing this, I do want to encourage people to turn on your video whenever you can, so that it's a much more interactive forum. Video on, audio off. All right, so we also prepared two quick questions in the poll. Very simple question, just to get a sense of the audience here. The first question is, how often do you use public transit? A binary choice, once a week or more, or less than that. The second one is your degree of engagement in public transit. I practice in the industry, I conduct research, I'm an advocate, or I'm just curious about the topic. So I see about 137 people participated. Let me give a few more seconds. Right, I will share the result. Jim, Fred, and Jeremy, can you see the result? 64% use public transit at least once a week. And 47 actually practice in the industry, 23% research, 16% advocate, and 13% just curious. Right, yeah. So before I give it to Jim to start the panel, I just reinforce the norm of this forum, which is everybody contribute an idea, right? Either a question or a comment directly type into the chat. Without further ado, let me pass the forum to Jim. Jim, please.
Let me share my screen. Let's see, can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right, thanks everybody. And it's good to be here with Jeremy Fine, who is the Chief Financial Officer for the Chicago Transit Authority, and with Fred Salvucci, who I would say needs no introduction, but for anyone who wants the introduction, he's senior lecturer at MIT, former transportation secretary, friend and mentor. This is a really important and timely topic, both for people who care about transit and frankly, people who don't care about transit, because we don't have a strong and fully functioning transit system in our metropolitan areas. That's going to have a negative impact on the economy. It's going to have a negative impact on the environment. It's going to have a negative impact on those who adhere to automobility, because without a good transit system, people will mode shift. And we see that happening in real time in a variety of places. So this is an overarching issue that we hope will resonate with all of you. And a little bit today about how to navigate this transit operating budget crisis. It's important to recognize that there's a difference between operating budgets and capital budgets. And in very simple terms, operating budgets are typically the budgets that you pay people from. Capital budgets are the budgets that you build stuff with, right? And so from an operating budget perspective, the real importance of this issue and the imminent shortfall is that that's where you get your professional capacity. That's where you get the ability to do the things, deliver the service, procure the systems and goods. All of that comes out of your operating budget. And if transit agencies don't have stable and sufficient and robust operating budgets, they're really in trouble. As we see here, this is a national problem, right? There was a sharp decline in transit ridership immediately following the emergence of the pandemic in the United States in March of 2020. There's been a steady recovery, but there's been a plateauing in most places where this transit ridership is roughly in the sort of 65, 70% of pre-pandemic. Why is that important? Before the pandemic, most transit agencies on average in the United States depended on fare revenue for about 30, 33% of their operating budget. Some were more, some were a little bit less, but on average, 30, 33%. If transit ridership has plateaued at a roughly 70%, that means that there's a significant fare revenue gap that hopefully will get filled when ridership returns, but is not imminent. And so transit agencies that benefited from congressional COVID relief funding to sustain them through the pandemic are finding that that funding is now coming to an end. It's being depleted, and transit agencies need to find stable, fair, long-term solutions to filling the operating budget gap. And I would say it's important to think about this, not just as filling the gap, but as doing that and then building a stronger platform for the future, right? This is not just about, what I like to say to people is, it's not just about filling the hole and walking away. First thing we need to do is plant a tree in the hole, which is the future of transit, where we want to be in the future, and then fill the hole. You can see this is a Massachusetts MBTA chart that shows how post-pandemic ridership patterns have begun to solidify. And you see in Massachusetts, it's at that 60% level. Fun fact, in the 1970s, the federal government contributed to the support of U.S. transit agencies through support for operating budgets. And you see here in calendar year 75, all through the 1970s, the federal government was picking up as much as 30%, supporting 30% of transit operating budgets. This is really important. The federal government, in my judgment, ought to have a role in continuing to sustain transit systems across the country. Why? Because the federal government cares about reduction of carbon emissions, because the federal government cares about social and economic equity, because the federal government cares about public health and the reduction of particulate matter emissions. There is a legitimate role for the federal government to return to a model like the one that existed in the 1970s. But that ended with the coming of the Reagan administration in January 1981. When we say, therefore, that we long for the good old days of transit, what we really are longing for are the 1970s, not the 1980s or the 1990s. Those were really not the good old days. There was chronic underfunding of transit. And those of us who pay attention to this carefully are recognizing that perhaps in this post-pandemic moment, we can capture some energy around commonly shared values: emissions reduction, equity, environment, and strengthening the economy, to promote the value of transit in urban and metropolitan areas in ways that decision makers will find persuasive. As I said earlier, this is a national problem. New York has made important strides to resolve their issues. They've raised the payroll tax component of their operating budget. They raised fares. They've inaugurated a forward-looking road user charging initiative in New York, as you all know. I don't personally, as I'm a lawyer by background, I don't personally believe that the legal claims that New Jersey or others are making will hold up in court. So I believe New York will be actually a little bit of a model in showing how to manage through the fiscal cliff. But everywhere else in the United States, people are struggling and people need to think about, where are we going to go? COVID relief funding was great. It enabled agencies to survive this once in 100-year or longer, we hope, disruption. But it was a stopgap measure, and that's how it worked. Now we need to move to a point of stabilization and growth. I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough for us to be satisfied with taking one-shot measures to fill fiscal holes. I think we need to ask ourselves in each community, where do we want our mobility platform to look like? What do we want it to look like in 2040, in 2045, in 2050, right? What do we want our transit agencies to look like in the future? And then work back from that to understand the level of investment and commitment that we need to start making now. And I'll just reiterate one point that I think is important. All the capital money in the world doesn't help you if you do not have the workforce and professional capacity to deliver, whether that's bus drivers, whether that's folks working in IT, whether that's folks working in procurement. Across the board, transit agencies need more capacity. And the way you support that is through stable, adequate, robust operating budgets. I'm going to shift the conversation to Jeremy Fine, CFO in Chicago, to talk a little bit about the Chicago experience and perspective. And when Jeremy's done, we'll get Fred's perspective on a variety of issues, including the role of the federal government. So Jeremy, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Jim, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Really want to just start off by giving a quick overview of CTA for folks that may not be as familiar with us as an entity. On the next page here, you'll see an overview of CTA. We're providing about 900,000 rides a day. Obviously that's down from the 1.5 million rides a day that we were providing pre-pandemic, but it's substantially up from the 250 to 500,000 rides a day that we were providing at kind of the depths of the pandemic. And I want to talk more about that later with regard to how we're positioning ourselves with our conversations with the state legislature. It's also important to note that CTA provides about 80 to 85% of all of the regional rides. Our partners over at Metra provide suburban rail, and PACE provides suburban bus, as well as ADA paratransit. And Metra constitutes about 9% of all regional rides, and PACE is about 8% of all regional rides. So as we talk about growing the pie, about growing the revenue pie, one of the other conversations that we want to have at CTA is about the allocation of funding, and we'll talk more about that in a moment as well. But RTA is the Regional Transit Authority that really oversees the three service boards, and that is with regard to allocations of funds, as well as petitioning the state for additional funding. So they're really kind of tip of the spear, along with the three service boards, on making the case for additional funding. The state requires the CTA, Metra, and PACE to achieve a 50% recovery ratio. And if we don't, hit that mark, then state funding is at risk. So it's a very hard requirement, which is a little abnormal within the industry to have that, that threat of having state funding withheld if we don't hit that recovery ratio. So again, this is something that we're looking to amend as we move forward as well. CTA highlights it's about a $2 billion budget, a $3.6 billion CIP program. And it's important to note, as Jim alluded to, that funding is really not fungible, particularly going from capital into operating because of the fact of where those funding sources are coming from. So, we really here in Northeast Illinois need funding on both fronts. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. 10,000 employees, 90% union, which kind of comes back to, cost escalations as we continue to move forward with regard to union contract negotiations and the impact of inflation. And then we have a very robust system, 8 rail lines, 127 bus routes, and reduction in service is really not supported by our customers, and this would really lead to, just the way that the system is set up, really lead to the death spiral that you hear often in the industry. But it's not a doom and gloom scenario. In fact, there's a lot of bright rays of sunshine here. We see ridership being up. We see service being more reliable. We see crime down. We see stations are cleaner. And we see our trackers or our information to our customers regarding reliability being up. So again, we're doing more. And I think it underscores how important the federal funding has been, is because when we know we have funding, we can be creative, we can be innovative. And this is part of the conversation with the state. On this next page, you see here, again, that $2 billion budget, the revenues coming from system generated revenues by about 20%, public funding about 55%, and federal relief funding about 24%. So again, it's very important to note that we've seen substantial growth in our fare and ridership numbers. This is in part because we've been able to adjust our fares, particularly on our passes, to make them more competitive with people's riding behavior. We've done system integration with the Regional Connect Pass and our passes with PACE. We've been able to recruit and retain employees, and we've added our safety and security measures, and that has allowed us to grow our ridership and grow our fare box a tremendous amount. In 2022, we saw about $50 million worth of growth over 21 levels, $48 million, or about 20%. In 23, we saw another $40 million, $38 million, and about 13% growth. So again, we're not back to where we wanted to be. We're not back to where we were pre-pandemic, but we have made tremendous strides. And again, it underscores how important of an essential service transit really is, and how we need to be there, as people continue to come back into the office and look for those opportunities to traverse the city. Public funding has been a big wind in our sails. Here in Illinois, we lagged a lot of the national changes to sales tax, but we did implement, the addition of online sales right before the pandemic, which was timely. That, along with cannabis sales, the impact of inflation and a strong economy, are driving public funding estimates for the 24 budget about 34%, or $275 million more than 2019 levels. So again, this has been a tremendous win in our sales, but we obviously know that these ebb and flow as the economy does. And then federal funding is a key component, as Jim indicated in his opening remarks. 24% of our operating revenue is assumed to come from federal relief funding. It's important to note, though, that because of outperformance on public funding, on fare and pass revenues, and better performance on our expenses, we've not had to draw down as much federal relief funds as we've assumed over the last several years. But again, we're estimating right now that these funds will last us through the end of 2025, which provides us a little time with regard to our efforts in Springfield, but not a lot of time, because it takes a long time to effectuate the changes, if changes need to be made with regard to our service levels and whatnot. On the next page, you see the funding cliff, and as Jim indicated, we were facing, as an industry, a funding cliff pre-pandemic. And again, I think that this just further highlights, how important it is to fund transit appropriately. Here in Northeast Illinois, that was further exacerbated by the fact that we, as an entity, a CTA, only received about 50% of operating funding, again, while we're providing about 80 to 85% of all rides. And we were only funding, we got funded a little bit better on capital, but still only about 60% there. The other problem that we had was the state was very intermittent in its bond program. So over the last 25 years, it was 5 years on, 5 years off, 5 years on, 5 years off, 5 years on. For a legacy system that is well over 100 years old, that just doesn't line up with the needs that we have as a state of good repair, let alone new projects. So that's something that we've again highlighted in the conversations that we've had with our partners at the state. But again, we're having a conversation about growing the pie and also the allocation of the pie. The pandemic, obviously, transit's faced existential risks, but I think if nothing else, we have always espoused to be an essential service. But I think the legislature kind of gets it in a way that they've never, probably seen it up close and personal the way that they have throughout the pandemic. Again, we were a critical lifeline to essential service workers and people trying to access those services. Even at the worst of the worst, we were still providing 250 to 500,000 rides a day. So again, that is not a point that's been overlooked by the state legislature. They've been very cognizant of that and understand that's why they need to fund us appropriately. And then with regard to the awarding of the federal funds, again, we've been very judicious with our funds. We have about $1 billion remaining, again, assuming that that will get us through the end of 25. But our gaps are big. Our gaps are $500 million, 20% of our budget, and growing, again, based on those, labor contracts as those come due. And fare increases are not enough. Service cuts are not enough. We can't get there. We can't close that type of gap and still maintain the systems. Fare increases pre-pandemic, we were only generating about 25 million from a 25-cent increase. And again, the service cuts would just lead to a dust spiral. So again, we're trying to be creative with our partners at the state, looking for funding opportunities for both operating and capital. And again, I think that what we have identified through a couple of key elements here that we'll talk about are some funding solutions that really kind of help us build the vision of what transit should be in the future, and not just kind of returning to the pre-pandemic levels. So on the next page, we talk about what we're focusing on in the conversation with the state, and that's really kind of around what our customers care about the most as well. So we've really focused on the meeting the moment plan, on our service, looking at optimizing schedules, safety and security, improving the security, the feet on the ground, the video monitoring, social services, customer experience with bus priority zones and all stations accessibility programs, zero emissions, and then digital tools like the tracker and chatbot and live streaming, as well as investing in our employees through recognition and incentives, monetary incentives to get people to come to work at CTA and to keep our valued employees here at CTA. And we've been able, again, with the federal funding to not only enhance those areas, but also enhance regional integration. And again, it's paid off dividends in us driving ridership and driving revenue. The legislative focus, as Genoa and Jim both alluded to, we've really been focusing away from just the economic growth that we've historically talked about with the state, but also accentuating the environmental agenda and the equity goals that we have and how they play hand in glove with what the state is trying to achieve and what the region is trying to achieve in those different areas. Skin in the game is a constant refrain from folks when we have conversations in Springfield. And we have a great story in that we've been able to effectuate lower expenses and increase non-fare box revenues by a cumulative $1 billion over the last 8 years. We've driven our admin expense ratio down to corporate type levels of 8.5%. Again, great stories. We will always look to do more, but we've been really kind of at the front end of the industry on really kind of cutting our expenses, growing non-fare box revenues. And again, we're looking at also growing our fare box, which we've done through the measures that I had highlighted before. And again, I think that we're looking at growing that pie, but also the reallocation of the pie as we move forward. But the strategic plan that the RTA and CMAP, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, have identified is really kind of 4 key buckets of funding. And that is sales tax, that can be an increase in the base or the rate or both. State funding, whether it be public transportation funds, road funds, other general operating funding from the state. Congestion pricing, which could come in the form of motor fuel taxes as an interim until you fully effectuate a congestion pricing mechanism. And as Jim alluded to, federal funds. And again, I think that fell off the table in the Reagan era. That's something that we're very adamant and interested in pursuing. And that could come in the form of different ways, whether it be formula or discretionary. Both of those were used during the CARES, CRISA, and ARP funding allocations. And something else that I would like to flag here is corporate opportunities, whether it be for-profit or not-for-profit. I think MIT has really kind of led an innovative approach here in the Boston area of looking at creating a corporate style program where companies can buy transit passes for their employees, and again, help the environment, help with equity issues, and also assist transit agencies across the country as well. So I know that was a pretty quick, run through of what we're doing, but I'll turn it over to Fred to walk through his slides, and glad to answer any questions as they come up.
Thank you. And let me introduce Fred by saying, I just want to say one thing. You mentioned fare recovery ratios, which have always been a little bit of an irritant for me. In the whole history of the world, you will never find a gas tax recovery ratio for highway funding. There's no such thing, right? We don't have gas tax recovery ratios, but we have fare recovery ratios, which to me is a symbol of how we don't do a good enough job treating transit as a public good. We need a strategy that gets us there. One of the best, if not the best, strategic thinker I know is Fred Salvucci. And Fred is going to talk a little bit about strategies for funding transit operating needs. Fred, the next 10 minutes is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jim. I'll try to use less than 10 minutes so there's enough time for people to participate and for us to hear your ideas. You can read these slides. I'd like to highlight a couple of things that Jim said and Jeremy said. The 1975 era experience that Jim pointed to when the federal government was providing about 25%, that's really a place we want to get back to for both short-term and long-term reasons. And I want to keep that in mind. And the case that Jeremy makes for how important the CTA is, they do a great job at the CTA, and they not only have to deliver, but they also have to let people know that they're delivering so that they can sell decision makers in Springfield on the essential nature of dealing with the fiscal cliff problem that's approaching. In the long run, we want transit to thrive and do much better than it did pre-COVID, but we're not going to survive if we don't deal with the fiscal cliff in the short term. And while I'd love to see more federal money soon, I think it's prudent in the immediate term to be focusing on state and local sources to deal with the fiscal cliff. Every state or region is going to have their own unique way of dealing with that. Jeremy's given us some ideas of how they're approaching it in Chicago. New York has done it a different way. Minnesota's a real success story on getting money on the table, but I think we should view, in Massachusetts, we're lucky. We haven't quite used that luck yet, but the voters approved a so-called millionaires tax, fair share tax, that imposed a surtax on incomes greater than $1 million. And that money is, by the terms of the referendum, to be divided equally between education and transportation. Now, it's transportation, not just transit. But it's also supposed to be spent on things that are unique. It's not supposed to just fill a hole in a budget. It's supposed to be doing things that wouldn't have otherwise happened. So it's a tremendous opportunity, but getting the support to actually do it, Massachusetts has to make the same kind of case that Chicago is making about the importance in transit and some of the unique roles that we're proposing to use the millionaires tax for. Those strategies, and they'll be different in every state, are important to deal with the crisis, because again, if we don't survive in the short term, we won't be here in the long term to deal with the growth that we all hope to see. The mobility pass that we implemented here at MIT, and in particular, Nigel Wilson and who many of you know, and John Adenucci, really just poured energy, especially John, for decades, to finally get the MIT administration to provide this benefit to all employees at MIT. And the unique things about what that does is we used to have a situation at MIT where employees could choose to get a parking benefit or a transit benefit. So if an employee chose parking, they got no transit benefit. We wanted to get rid of that so-called binary problem so that any MIT employee who gets a parking benefit also is entitled to free use of transit. And the utilization by the MIT employees can be measured by the MBTA, and they send the bill to MIT. So it is perceived as universally available to all employees and of zero marginal cost to use transit. So there's a big incentive to use it, but the MBTA is being reimbursed by MIT for that usage. The rationale for why MIT should do that, it's great for us employees, but the rationale was that MIT was spending a huge amount of money converting parking lots to parking garages because they can no longer afford parking lots. The space is at a premium. We needed lab space and classroom space and dormitory space, which meant we have to build in the parking lot, which means you're going to lose the parking or spend a huge amount of money building underground parking garages. So we were able to make the case that the savings in parking expenditures that MIT would not need to make would more than compensate for the very generous benefit to employees of essentially free use of transit. The numbers worked for MIT. It's a good model. We encourage people to consider it, but it's not going to make huge amounts of money for the MBTA. The MIT isn't losing money, it's gaining money. The MBTA is gaining money from this program, but it's not going to fill the gap of the fiscal cliff. It's modestly beneficial from a financial point of view. Its real strength, and I would urge all transit agencies to look at this strength, the real strength is gaining more riders, because that's the political base to get more money to provide decent amounts of transit. those of us in the industry can talk a lot about how important transit is, but we need the testimony of riders who are using the system to buttress that case. So the important thing about initiatives like the MIT Mobility Pass, like the PASS program that the CTA recently enacted that resulted in a solidification and growth in ridership, the revenue is nice, but it's modest. It's the ridership stabilization and growth that's essential to the political base to make the case that this is an area that state government needs to put more money in. The state government role, I think, is not just to fill the gap, but in the longer term sense, we need a federal initiative to get the federal government at least back to where it was in 1975 in terms of supporting operating subsidies. And almost certainly with any federal program any of us has ever seen, there's going to have to be a local match. So the short-term use of solving the fiscal cliff is so we can survive. But in the longer term, if we can succeed at a federal strategy, then that revenue base that's strengthened to deal with the fiscal cliff will be there to provide the local match that'll be required if we can succeed in getting the federal government to step back to where they were in the 1975 period. Now, why should the federal government do that? It wasn't just transit that was hurt by COVID. It was cities that were hurt by COVID. It is the gasoline tax, which is the revenue base for the roadway system, is threatened by what we hope will be success on the EV initiatives. So transit at the federal level has always needed a partnership with roadway interests in order to get legislation through. The roadway interests need a way to solve the problem of the declining gasoline tax revenues. So there's an alliance to be made around that issue that I think can become a winning strategy in Washington. The last point is there was a huge revenue break in the pattern achieved by President Biden when he got the infrastructure program through. The pattern break is the bipartisan bill that succeeded was not paid for through user taxes or gasoline taxes. It was paid for through deficit finance. And politically, that's the only way they could get it through. So only the federal government can do deficit finance. You can't do that at the state level. So there are lots of reasons we need a long-range strategy to be focused on Washington and focused on alliance with roadway interests. But again, we have to do our job locally to deal with the fiscal cliff in the short run. Thanks for listening to these thoughts, and I'll toss it back to you, Jim.
Thank you. I just want to wrap it up. Thank you both, and then Jim, I will begin the questions. I'd ask Bhuvan if he would to maybe put in the chat. We just wrote a report on this topic Fred is talking about, which is what happens when more and more people are driving electric vehicles, what happens to the gas tax, what happens to transportation revenue. And I want to underscore, I think the highway lobby will figure this out if they haven't already, that the stable long-term source of revenue for them, the gas tax, is going away. Transit needs to be in the conversation and at the table when we're talking about revolutionary new ways of thinking about funding our transportation needs. Road user charging is not really revolutionary, but the whole concept of shifting from the gas tax to a more technology-based platform for federal and state transportation funding is a conversation that's imminent. And it's a conversation where transit needs to have a seat at the table and a large voice. With that, Jim, I pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Jim, Jeremy, and Fred. Before I get to my question and audience question, Jeff Busby is also joining the forum today. Jeff is an alum, and we're actually classmates the same year. So it's so great to have Jeff here. Jeff is currently the Chief Operating Officer at TransLink from Vancouver. Vancouver somehow is defying the trend in the US, being in Canada, of course, yeah. So the ridership recovered much better than most of us. So Jeff, please share us your experience.
Thanks, Chinua. It's really good to be with you, and this is a really important conversation, not just for the U.S. properties, but we're having the same fiscal challenge in Canada. I think the Canadian cities have recovered their ridership faster than our U.S. peers, and that could be the subject of a whole nother series on what explains that. But I'd offer maybe two thoughts. One is that while ridership has recovered, fare revenue has not. And the reason for that is that the types of trips that people are taking, the types of people that are using transit have changed, and they're using transit in a way that has shifted towards lower average fare products. An example is that we charge a premium for traveling by zone on the weekdays, and our weekday ridership is at about 89% of pre-pandemic levels. We don't charge those same zones on the weekends, and this is kind of a historical fare practice. And our ridership is now more than pre-pandemic on the weekends. Just an example of how we've had to shift to our thinking about recovery, not just from looking at the number of users, but really what products they're using. TransLink's revenues are really coming from three sources: fares, fuel levy, and property tax in about equal amounts pre-pandemic. And fares obviously have taken a big hit. The fuel levy is, to James's point, structurally declining and should be declining as we're encouraging the transition towards electric vehicles and more fuel efficiency. And so really the only reliable source we have for revenue in our context is property tax. Where we see a path forward is to, I think the point that was being raised is really building local and provincial, in our case, political support for new revenue tools for transit, and talking about transit not so much in its role in supporting the economy, which is important, but really broadening the conversation towards transit aligning with government policies around tackling the affordability challenges that are facing households coming out of this big inflationary period, tackling the climate crisis, and also in the Canadian context, dealing with growth. Canada is opening up its borders to about 500,000 new residents, and about 10% of those new residents have moved to our region. That's been really fueling a lot of the demand for transportation services, a lot of the growth in this region. And so because we see those as important government priorities and we see our role in supporting those, that's how we're targeting the support that we will need from senior government. And I think building those constituencies is really critical and needs to be done. While there may be support that comes from national governments, it really does need to be done at that kind of grassroots local level. Thanks for the opportunity to share some thoughts. Good to see everybody.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'll pass the forum to Bull in a minute, but let me start with two questions to the panel here. The first one is Jim and I had a conversation right before the forum, talking about that the federal emergency fund in Boston actually lasted longer than he thought. But why is this the case? It's only because we don't have enough bus drivers to pay. That's such an ironic situation there, right? I also had to say that most of our budget actually pays for the human capital. I want to hear from you guys, what's the state of this human capital, our capacity in the transit industry in US, and also Jeff, you some thought on Vancouver as well. So that's the first one. The second one, when we talk about the source of revenue, we have users like the fare box. We have then talk about government. In terms of the corporation, right? I want to mention the case that in Crossrail in London, United Kingdom, they successfully convinced the banks, the insurance companies, saying, you guys are the most important beneficiary if we have a good public transit system. And they made the case successfully, and the corporation participated in this, right? So is there any possibility in the US or Canada to engage the broader set of stakeholders or participate in this? To you and all the Jim and or everybody in the panel, any question you can, either of the two, please.
Well, I guess, I just would make an observation. You know, Jeremy made a point of showing how aggressively Chicago CTA has dealt with the expense side of the house. Because a lot of people will say, well, you know, what about the expense side? And they've done a good job with that. Jeremy may want to say a little bit more. I would point out, as Jinhua said, there's been across the country and here locally in Boston, a significant workforce shortage coming out of the pandemic, right? Particularly with bus drivers, but across the board. Guess how you deal with that? You pay people more. You give people better working conditions, right? And so from an expense side perspective, we need to really be more realistic about our expectations, and particularly in the post-pandemic environment where we have 3.5% national unemployment. And where frankly, people, I think, have different, younger people in particular, have different ideas about what kind of jobs they want to have, what kind of growth they want to have in those jobs, and whether entry-level jobs are going to be their lifetime jobs or just something that they have for a few years. The world is a different place, and I think we've got to have different expectations about what we can expect on the expense side from transit agencies. I'm just curious, Jeremy, what your reaction is to that.
Yeah, I mean, we've done a really good job of effectuating some of those changes. You know, the $1 billion of cumulative savings that we've accumulated over the last 8 years has been a combination of, you know, labor adjustments. You know, and Jim, to your point, I mean, we've been looking at, you know, eliminating or freezing non-service or safety related positions because, again, trying to put all of our resources or as much of our resources as possible towards that frontline service. You know, we've done some things on the healthcare side, you know, structuring the ATU agreement, you know, fuel and power savings, you know, capital investments to bend our cost curve on operations, and looking at non-fare box revenues. But again, kind of going back to like, how do we keep and incentivize people to stay? It's going to be a huge driver as we move forward with our next ATU agreement on what our cost structure looks like. So it's going to be dramatic, you know, it's going to be dramatically higher because of, you know, incentives to try to keep people here, to keep people coming into the door. You know, these are tough jobs. You know, trying to get people to be an operator, it's a tough position. I mean, you're not only having to navigate, you know, the streets, but you're having to do it with a bus load or a train load full of people. So these are very difficult jobs, and trying to get you know, those barriers of entry lowered is something that we've really focused on here at CTA. With regard to buses, you know, we were requiring people pre-pandemic to have CDLs, you know, before they applied for a job. Well, we've eliminated that, you know, because that was a barrier of entry that people weren't able to come out of pocket for that CDL prospectively. You know, we've allowed bus drivers to come in as full-time instead of just part-time and graduate up. You know, we've tried to incentivize people through monetary, you know, incentives as well to stay and to come on board. Looking at what the frictional cost is of hiring new employees. So, you know, we have kind of a threshold there. So all of those have been very successful. It's allowed us to hire, you know, like 1,000 new bus operators over the last year, you know, a couple hundred, you know, rail operators. But we, you know, we have a constant churn. You know, there's still a large percentage of the employees, the operators, that are graduating out because of their, you know, because of where they are in terms of retirement. So we have, you know, a huge, you know, kind of friction there that we're having to overcome, as well as make up that gap of what we have still in terms of just the overall labor shortage.
I noticed.
Also, I see Marianne O'Hare, who is the Chief Financial Officer from MBTA, join us today. Marianne, share with us your thought.
Thank you. So Jeremy, we've done a lot of the similar things, like the CDLs. We now, you know, hire people, help them get a CDL. We also raised the hourly rate, and that hit a huge improvement. We were like low $20. Now it's like $30 an hour. And minute we made that change, the recruiting, like, you know, triple, double, and we've been hiring up to our 24 budget. It's like a switch. All of a sudden, we just hit I think the right sweet spot in terms of getting people to apply for the jobs. But we've also done things like sign-on bonuses, retention bonuses, I'm wondering if you guys have done things like that. And we're also done like mobile, we've had a mobile bus that went into the neighborhoods like of Dorchester, where I come from, and other parts of the city, and that has attracted people because it's right in the neighborhood. So I think we're trying things that are different, and it's definitely helping the MBTA. But I'm with you, Jeremy, where we're going to see, and I've built a team over the last 4 or 5 years I've been at the T, really even the administrative side, like we've got to maintain those people because they're doing really incredible. I'm talking about my finance team, not me, my finance team, and they're on the screen here too. We've just built a really good team, and if we lose them, it's rebuilding, training, it's wasted time and effort. And I heard you, Jeremy, say the friction cost of hiring. That's something we've looked at, like how much does it cost to bring in an admin person versus an operator, and you got to figure out those costs that won't hit your financials, but they're real, right? Like it's a hidden cost of the time that it takes to hire a new person, time it takes to get them on board, and these are complicated businesses, very complicated businesses. So I'm with you, Jeremy. We're doing a lot of the same thing.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is it's a confluence in Springfield that's helpful to some degree. Obviously, it's costing us more money, but you have the support of the union when you're having those discussions in Springfield for additional funding. So there is a partnership or a confluence of partnership opportunities there as we have those conversations in Springfield.
Great. Thank you, Marianne and Jeremy. We'll give to Bhuvan for the question and answer, have a quick summary, and Jim, at the very end, we'll give it to you to have an overall conclusion for this session, right? Bhuvan, please.
Thank you, Gino. So a very lively discussion and a lot of questions. So I think the first question, I'm going to combine a few that were on, the work from home and the employee-based pass. Given that we've been seeing post-pandemic, a lot of people are working from home, will that change the companies from incentivizing funding of transit benefits? And could we have, like, instead of an unlimited pass, a 10-day pass? And with the legacy of work from home and gig work, it should be increasingly and people are making transportation decisions based on factors that go beyond the workplace commute. So any thoughts on opportunities to shift the vector for providing these types of incentives from employer-based incentives to something that is more community-focused, for that, Sunday trip to the beach or Monday trip to a co-working space?
Fred or Jeremy or even Jeffrey, if do you have a thought on that as from a fair policy perspective?
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick. I think that it's an interesting conversation, and you talk about you hear a lot about fare capping and opportunities like that, and it's really I think Bhuvan, what the underlying point of the question I think is really like what cohorts are we trying to attract and trying to retain and trying to enhance and assist in with regard to kind of the larger equity issues at play. And I think that that's one of the things that we're that we've looked at and wrestle with regard to what's the best way to address the problems and the opportunities there. And if you're able to, is it better to do it through opportunities like UPass program, university pass program, or corporate pass programs, or things like that to incentivize different cohorts to utilize the system more? We're all for those. If you're looking at an opportunity through the fare capping, is that really addressing the cohorts, or is a more expansive free and reduced fare ride program addressing those problems more efficiently? So I think it's really like and I think we have a much better handle coming out of the pandemic of what our ridership cohorts look like, how we can motivate them to move in a more substantive manner. And I think, again, just trying to identify those opportunities, craft a product for those opportunities. And frankly, the folks at MIT have done a great job of helping us identify those opportunities and craft those different strategies so that we are seeing productive opportunities come out of those and driving ridership and revenue.
Thanks, Jeremy. So the next question is, this one on budget. So are you at CT or even at the MBTA looking at using CapEx to reduce OpEx, such as driverless trains, automated signaling, remote servicing of stations, increasing automation in the overall process? So I'm in Doha and they have like the fastest autonomous subway trains running over here up to speeds of 62 miles an hour. So all the trains are driverless here. So I'm just wondering if this is something, or do the union issues, are those causing problems? I don't know. I'm just wondering if this could be one alternative.
I think it's not a practical thing to be looking at for at least a decade in the United States. To be explicit on something Jeremy just mentioned, we need labor as an ally. We're in a canoe, we're drifting towards a waterfall, and we better all have a paddle and row like hell the other way to not go over that waterfall. It's no time to start fighting each other in the canoe. And that's the case with our highway interests, with our workers. We need alliances if we're going to survive, and especially if we're going to thrive. I think automation is, I'm dubious that it's a good idea a decade from now, but for now, it's just the wrong time to even think about it.
Well, I would add to that. I mean, if there's one significant national concern across the board, and I noticed a comment from Eileen Shu at LA Metro, it's public safety. I'm a regular transit user. I want a bus driver driving my bus. I don't want the bus to drive itself. I want a train conductor in the front car of the train. I don't want to. I mean, I think that we underestimate the safety implications of removing the human being from the bus or the train in an effort to automate this. So I'm not that old that I consider myself a Luddite or a curmudgeon. I think this is a real public safety issue that needs to be understood, and that the rider's perception of safety should come first, even if that means that we have bus drivers and train conductors when in the future we might not want to have any.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so there was a lot of discussion on the congestion/cordon pricing that, New York City is doing, and, Boston's ongoing conversations. Given the, current, state of the T, where it's, we have having a lot of service reductions, can we realistically follow New York City's model, or is it a chicken and egg scenario where, because we don't have this, we can't do that, but because we, there was an example of Singapore, where the congestion fee was implemented 12 years before their first subway line opened. So is that something which could happen in Boston, or Singapore is a totally different animal and it's not, fair to compare Boston to Singapore? Your thoughts on that?
It's never fair to compare Boston to Singapore. Well, this goes to the report that you and I helped co-author, right, with Seamus and Yunhan. I mean, I think the future, post-gas tax future, will largely be road user charging systems of some type. Transit needs to figure out how to be a recipient of that revenue. If we think about revolutionizing how we think about transportation funding so it's more holistic and less siloed, I think that's the future we should be trying to build.
I also just want to add one word about technology, right? Fred, I share your concern. It is at this moment, alliance with the union, et cetera, is critical, right? But that being said, when the technology is ready, we also want to consider that we can redefine the jobs of the drivers and the trains so that they can more focus on serving to the customer rather than maneuvering the streets or the tracks, right? And also, automation on the train is not a new idea at all. I mean, it's been there for decades now, right? I don't want to say that we will preserve the possibility, but I do see that at this stage, it's the worst time to really anger the union and fighting with each other and get a big hole on this, right? We already over time, Jim, the last word to you, and we'll conclude the session, Chris.
Well, thanks, everybody, and thank you, Jeremy and Fred in particular. I'm one of those who has a strong belief that transit is a public good. And I just leave with that this fiscal cliff conversation is really a precursor conversation to the larger one that we need to have and will have in this country about how we fund transportation revenue in a post-internal combustion engine era, in a post-pandemic era. We cannot do any of the things that we say are our shared values in this country. We can't build a stronger, more equitable economy that respects public health issues and respects lowering emissions issues. We can't do any of that unless we figure out how to elevate and promote the use of public transportation in urban and metropolitan areas. That requires stable, fair funding sources going forward. I think we need to revisit the old way we were thinking about this in the 20th century that we've carried over into this century. And I'm hopeful that this discussion will spark in each one of you a new way of thinking about this that you can bring to your local city and town. And we at MIT are always happy to engage this conversation because we're passionate about it, and some of us are even transit nerds. So thank you for the opportunity.
This is wonderful. Thank you, Jim, Fred, Jeremy, Jeff, and Marianne for joining us. And please, everyone, join me thank the panel for the great presentation and conversation. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Great. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next Friday. Bye-bye.